All right, so there's so many quarterbacks that are good this year, Matthew, which is why Kirk Cousins, as you mentioned earlier, is not even a top 20 ranked quarterback this year. It feels weird because it was a down season last year in terms of expectations, right? They did not meet them. The numbers can sort of paint a different story. Kirk Cousins wasn't terrible last year. 30 touchdown passes. He completed 70.1% of his passes. That was the second best in the NFL. Kirk Cousins, though, Matthew, what he was he was consistently above average, rarely great, and rarely poor.
Yeah.
The problem in fantasy football is your quarterback is an edge when he is not above average. He is well above average, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and the other concern here is that we know that the Vikings want to run the ball more. So they replaced
a ton more.
Right. So Kevin Stefanski took over as the offense coordinator over the last 3 games of last year with the idea to want to be more emphatic in terms of the run game, that we want to emphasize the run game there. And so over the last 3 games, again, super small sample size, but it is what it is, he was quarterback 16. He averaged 15.8 fantasy points per game. And by the way, 15.8 fantasy points per game over a full season is basically just below Andy Dalton last year. Would have been, right? I mean, so I think the concern there is that one of the things that if you're going to be run heavy, and you're going to have a very good defense, which is what we expect both things for the Minnesota Vikings this year.
Right.
You're not getting into crazy shootouts. Kirk Cousins was an elite fantasy quarterback with the Redskins for 2 reasons. One is their defense was awful, so he kept getting into shootouts, right? And secondly, his legs. He would run for 4 or 5 touchdowns, and he just wasn't doing that. And so these days, if you're not going to be passing for 4,500 yards and 40 touchdowns, you have to give me something with your legs. And even with a run-heavy offense, I think you'll see Kirk doing a little bit more bootleg stuff this year, but still, it's hard to expect significant rushing numbers from him. And so in a run-heavy offense and scores that you would expect to be low because the defense we expect to be one of the better ones in the NFL, I have him just at QB 21. And he's a very good quarterback, but it just goes to show you how deep the position is, Field.
The position is very deep. This running back, this offense, as you said, Matthew, wants to be run heavy. Kevin Stefanski has said many times now that they want to be run-oriented. Mike Zimmer has said as much. Anybody who's been to training camp there will tell you that's clearly the focus, which is why Dalvin Cook is a really interesting player this year, Matthew. Shot out like a cannon as a rookie. It was unbelievable coming out of Florida State before he got that knee injury early on in this rookie year. Last season was somewhat of a throwaway year. He got hot late, Matthew, but it took him a while to get to the point where we expected him to be. He had the hamstring issues. It was a frustrating season. Are we back in on Dalvin Cook? Fully geared up. Can he be a difference-making running back? Because if he is the healthy Dalvin Cook that we saw at the outset of his NFL career, the guy legitimately could be a top 5 running back this season.
I kind of weirdly am. I'm normally risk averse, but I'm sitting here looking at it. I have him at number 18 overall. His current ADP is 22nd overall. He's currently going as running back 11. I have him at running back 10, so I'm slightly higher on him in my ranks, and I'm a little bit higher on him in terms of the overall here. He is potentially a league winner. Look, if he can stay healthy, and obviously that is a massive if here, Field, but you think about his talent, right? And we've seen this for his career. He averages 4.7 yards per carry, right?
Good number.
He caught at least 3 passes in 9 of 11 games last year. We know he can be used in the passing game here. No Latavius Murray to vulture stuff from him, and we'll talk about Alexander Madison in a second. But we expect Dalvin Cook to be the guy, and I don't think you can underestimate, not only does Kevin Stefanski want to run, but Gary Kubiak is on this staff.
Sure.
And I don't think you can underestimate the impact that Gary Kubiak can have for a running back, for the fantasy potential of a running back, especially somebody that has the skill set of Dalvin Cook. Last 5 years when Gary Kubiak ran the Houston Texans, they were 4th in running back fantasy points, the Texans were. They were 3rd in red zone rush percentage. Obviously, a lot of that Arian Foster. But still, in his 2 seasons with Denver, Broncos ran the ball in the red zone and goal-to-go situations at an above-average rate. Like, Gary Kubiak and that one-zone cut read, man, like, that works. And it's a perfect fit for what I think Dalvin Cook does well.
If you want to run the football a ton, the pieces have been put in place this offseason. You've hired, as you just mentioned, Gary Kubiak, who's an excellent job coordinator running game. You have a very good running back in Dalvin Cook, and you have an outstanding defense that will allow you to be able to run the football a ton because you're not going to be playing from behind as frequently as other teams will be, as you just mentioned. Dalvin Cook got hot in December last year, 5.69 yards per carry. I get it. that was a during stretch. They went 2-3. It was not the most impressive
But to
showing.
your point, under Stefanski, weeks 15, 16, and 17, they were 6th in rush percentage, the Vikings were.
Yes, they were much more run-oriented last year, which is why Dalvin Cook, the stars may be aligning for him to re-cement himself as a player that could become a league winner in fantasy football this season.
To me, once you get past that top 8 or 9, so you start getting into the dicey guys, right? So whether
There's
it's
a lot of
Dalvin Cook, right? Dalvin Cook, I consider Le'Veon Bell a dicey guy. I know not everyone does. We just talked about, there are guys where there are question marks.
Yep.
Of the question mark guys, I don't know that there's anyone that has a higher upside, with the exception of maybe Le'Veon Bell, than Dalvin Cook.
I think Le'Veon Bell or James Conner, depending on whether you consider Conner a dicey guy, just because
I have
fact
in that dicey range because of the Jalen Samuels, Benny Snell stuff, and that offense is going to be slightly different, obviously. You take away Antonio Brown, I'm sorry, your offense takes a hit.
No question. I think the offense in Pittsburgh has more upside in terms of touchdowns,
100%.
and then Le'Veon has more upside in terms of catching ability. But still, Dalvin Cook, a player we like, and it's always good to have a note tucked away on who should you be drafting if you are drafting a handcuff. This year, it's Alexander Madison. He came out of Boise State, Matthew. Some people felt like he was overdrafted, but the Vikings loved him in the 3rd round, and so far the early reviews are good. Not a lot of analysis, in my opinion, right now on Alexander Madison, other than to file away that he would be the running back to draft if you take Dalvin Cook.
To me, I think he's one of the highest, especially given how run heavy we expect this team to be.
Yep.
And how injury prone Dalvin Cook has been in his career. To me, he should be one of the first handcuffs drafted. And I'm not talking about the guys that are going to. I'm not talking about the Latavius Murrays of the world who is going to who has a role regardless of what happens to Alvin Kamara, right? Or Darrell Henderson who has a role regardless of what happens to Ty Gurley. I'm talking about just pure their fantasy value is dependent on the health of another player. Once you get into that range, he should be one of the first guys off your field. To your point, he's the only player in FBS with at least 1,000 yards rushing, 12 rushing touchdowns, and 25 or more receptions each of the past 2 seasons. I interviewed Alexander Madison out in L.A. In May at the NFLPA Rookie Premiere.
Yep.
And I asked him, and I said, has the coaching staff, it's still early, it'd only been at the rookie camp, but I said, have they talked to you? And he's just like, yeah, goal line. He said, my expectation is, he said, I think I'll get some goal line work there. I think you'll see me in the backfield some with Dalvin as well, as a compliment
I don't like
to
that
Dalvin.
goal line part. Don't like it at all. Don't like it at all. I don't like the goal line part.
Yeah, well,
I mean, just because of the fact that I'd be, investing in Dalvin Cook.
100%. I get that. And listen, he's still young, but my point is like all due respect to like Rock Thomas, Alexander.
No, not longer there anymore.
Huh?
Rock Thomas gone.
Yeah. To my point.
Yeah, to your point. Rock Thomas is gone. Maybe the best wide receiver.
Who is it? Is Mike Boone still there? Who else is there? Like all those guys. Huh?
Amir Abdullah.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
They signed Amir Abdullah.
Let's discuss the Vikings wide receivers. Adam Thielen comes first only because his current ADP is slightly ahead of Stephon Diggs. Matthew, the best wide receiver in football the first half of last season. Is Adam Thielen closer to the guy that we saw at the beginning of the year, more like the guy that we saw at the end of the year when he was a non-startable player in the playoffs?
Yeah.
Where do we rest here? Like, is this going to settle in the middle somewhere, or is it possible that he actually gravitates towards, like, he's not going to be the guy that's a total non-factor. But is he going to reassert himself as arguably a top 5 fantasy wide receiver every single week?
Well, you're a little concerned about the run-heavy nature of the offense.
Right.
But I do think it's a little bit too much of a concern, right? And so forget numbers for a second. I think Adam Thielen's one of the best wide receivers in the NFL.
The Vikings do too. You know why? They paid him $70 million this offseason.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, so I think he's just a special player. And so, like Kirk Cousins, you don't pay Kirk Cousins $90 million to just hand off the ball. Will they be run heavy? Yes.
That would be sweet.
But they are, right? Can you imagine? But they're still going to throw the ball. Even the most run heaviest teams in the NFL throw the ball.
Right.
And so, I mean, again, think about the most run heavy team in the NFL last year was the Seattle Seahawks. Tyler Lockett, still a very valuable fantasy commodity, obviously.
Yeah.
So they're going to throw the ball. And so I think Adam Thielen, Kirk Cousins, if you look at his career, has always loved the slot guy. He's more comfortable. He's more accurate when he's throwing between the numbers. And so when Thielen's numbers in the slot have been terrific, and you look at, you go back to like sort of Jamison Crowder and sort of the Redskin days. And so to me, Adam Thielen, I still have him as a top 12 fantasy wide receiver. I mean, the 9 touchdown receptions. Like, there was a stretch there last year where he was the number 1 wide receiver in fantasy. He was actually, end of the year, even with that poor end to the season, still finished the year as the 7th best wide receiver in fantasy. He was a top 6 receiver in 6 straight weeks 2 through 7 there. So, yeah, for me, Adam Thielen, 9 touchdowns last year. Had a nose for the end zone. I prefer him to Stephon Diggs.
Yeah, and it's splitting hairs. I really do believe that. We get a lot of questions. Which Vikings wide receiver do you prefer? My retort is often this, Matthew. Like, you're not really choosing between them. You're choosing between who do you prefer amongst the likes of Adam Thielen versus a Brandon Cooks, or Adam Thielen versus an Amari Cooper. But still, Stephon Diggs, I agree with you. I do have Thielen just a little bit higher. Diggs last year saw his volume go up. 36% more catches per game last season than his career average prior to that point, but a career low in terms of 10 yards per catch. As a matter of fact, neither one of those guys was really a vertical threat last season. So I guess what we're kind of asking ourselves is this. We've got a run-heavy offense. We've got 2 elite wide receivers. Can a run-heavy offense carry 2 fantasy wide receivers?
I think they can carry 2 wide receiver 2s. I mean, again, because they don't have much else. Right, I mean, all due respect to Chad Beebe, but right, I mean, like it's gonna be the Thielen and Diggs show, and it's one of the reasons why I'm more bullish on Thielen this year than not, even with the run heavy nature of the offense, and also because why I prefer Thielen to Diggs is that Diggs gets hurt,
right?
Has never played 16 games in a season, and in fact, if you look at the numbers when Diggs is on the injury report, even if he's active and plays in the game, his numbers aren't great. He's just a guy that if there's anything wrong with him physically, he just isn't a guy that's able to produce fantasy numbers. And so so that's why I prefer Thielen to Diggs. I think there's less risk with Thielen, and I do think there'll be times when Diggs is out of the game, and you'll see a lot more targets towards Adam Thielen. They're both terrific. I mean, he ended the year great. I think a touchdown in 6 of his last 8 for Stephon Diggs here. But again, just the injury history and a little bit more volatile. I feel there's a higher floor with Adam Thielen.
The numbers
maybe a higher
at the end
ceiling
of
with
last
Diggs.
year, we try not to focus simply on the year-end point totals for players in fantasy because they cannot be reflective. But I think in some ways, the year-end point total for each of these players last year was reflective of what they are. You said they can have 2 wide receiver 2s. They do. That's right. Like, I think that neither one of these guys, if I had to bet the house on one of them being a wide receiver 1, I'd bet Thielen. But I think both of them are like somewhere between the 11th and 15th best fantasy wide receivers this season. And I expect them to finish as such. They can both be sustained. And I know Kyle's telling me both of them were top 10 last year. That's okay. I think more reflective would be somewhere between 11 and 15.
Yeah, 100%. I think there is a we think the talent will be there. We think a target share will be there, but we think ultimately they're not going to their scoring games won't be as high, and so there are players out there with higher potential, and so they sort of eat into each other. But they can listen. The Rams have 3 number 2 wide receivers.
Right.
I mean, I have Cooks, Woods, and Kupp all in that 11 to 20 range.
I think I have them in the exact range as well. Let's put a pin in the Vikings conversation with the tight ends, and we could talk about them as one because Kyle Rudolph's volume is impacted by Irv Smith, their 2nd-round pick out of Alabama, an incredibly young prospect, solid career there. It had a lot of accolades during his time with the Crimson Tide. Can he make a mark? And if so, does that mean that Kyle Rudolph's role has sort of been cannibalized?
It's weird. You would think that, except for the fact they paid Kyle Rudolph this offseason.
Big-time extension. Yeah.
Big-time extension for him. I mean, when they drafted Irv Smith, you sort of thought, well, maybe the writing's on the wall for Kyle Rudolph, and yet then the opposite of it.
Right. It's weird. Now,
they saw what the Lions did with Jesse James and T.J. Hawkinson. They were like, we got to follow suit with the leaders in the division.
Something I will say is that Kyle Rudolph is legitimately one of the most respected players in the NFL. Walter Payton Man of the Year award caliber of individual. Means a lot to that community in Minnesota. Him and his wife have done incredible work with the local hospital, and especially for young children who have, dealing with very difficult things. I don't want to say that that's the reason why the Vikings extended him, but he means more than just what the numbers tell you is what I'm trying to say.
That makes a ton of sense. By the way, Kyle Rudolph was the 7th best tight end in fantasy last year. You want to win a bar bet? Like no one, like, if you go to a bar and ask a random fantasy football player, hey, what do you think Kyle Rudolph finished last year? There's no way they come up with 7. I don't know, 12, 14, something like that. The quietest 7th best fantasy tight end season in history here. It's interesting. When I interviewed Irv Smith as well at the NFLPA rookie premiere, and I asked him, have you been texting with Kirk? Have you talked? And he said, yeah, Kirk told me I remind him of Jordan Reed. And we talked about what Kirk did with Reed in Washington,
sure.
Which sort of, obviously, that makes my ears perk up. So I think Irv Smith is really interesting for dynasty leagues, but I do think, to your point, I think they will cannibalize each other this year. If I had to pick one, I would pick Kyle Rudolph, who,
If going into the season, would you feel comfortable with him as your starter, Kyle Rudolph?
No.
Yeah, I think I'd aim a little bit higher myself. I think there's enough guys that are solo acts in their offensive tight end that I'd rather lean that way.
Yeah, I mean, you think about that Week 16 game against the Lions.
Yeah, 22% of his points came in that game, right?
9 for 122 and 2 touchdowns for Kyle Rudolph, Daniel. Nice job by your Lions to not even guard him. I thought that was an interesting choice defensively.
Hey, we all make decisions in life, and we stuck by that one, Matthew.
Got it.
All right, that's the Vikings double trouble.
Anyway, so there you go. Here's the thing. It feels like he's touchdown dependent. You know what I mean? And most tight ends are in fantasy. And so if you're going to you'd rather a guy that's, could get you 4 for 40, with a shot at a touchdown. Kyle Rudolph feels like just kind of like needs a touchdown to be relevant, and there's other tight ends that are going ahead of him that maybe don't necessarily need to score but could still put up some points.
In most cases, when you have 2 tight ends that are relevant, you have none for fantasy football. So that's our Vikings recap for Double Trouble.
Thanks for watching ESPN on YouTube. For more sports highlights and analysis, be sure to download the ESPN app. And for live streaming sports and premium content, subscribe to ESPN+.